Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode we'll bring you its insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this week's episode we find out more about an ongoing study between Teagasc and UCD examining how companion forages, namely chicory, plantain, red and white clover, perform alongside a perennial ryegrass sward in sheep systems. Now to tell us more about this, we're joined by McGrane, who's a postgraduate student based in Athenry and who's working on the project. Lisa starts by explaining a bit more about the crops and how they're being managed as separate farmlets in the system. We move on to discuss how they're examining the effects on animal performance. They're also investigating how the sward performs under grazing conditions and the changes seen in the sward composition during the year. In addition to the animal component of the study, Lisa discussed another aspect of it that is looking at various establishment methods and seeding rates to see how these influence sward composition and sward performance. Part of that study is also examining the effect that post-grazing sward heights have on these companion forages and how they perform. But to start off, Lisa gives us a bit more background to the project she's involved in.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student in here in Teagasc and Athenry, and I'm carrying out a research project in conjunction with UCD and with Teagasc, looking at it's called an evaluation of companion forages in combination with perennial ryegrass to increase animal performance and output in pasture-based sheep production systems. And I'm carrying this out with Dr. Philip Creighton in Teagasc and Professor Tommy Boland in UCD. And so basically our study is somewhat a follow-on from some multi-species work that Tommy would have carried out in lions previously. This study looks at each of the companion forages along with across the study. The treatments that I'm following are perennial ryegrass only, perennial ryegrass plus white clover, perennial ryegrass plus red clover, and perennial ryegrass plus plantain, and perennial ryegrass plus chicory. And then so we just follow these swards across the different trials.
So as opposed to maybe some of the work in UCD was a full mixed species sward, you're looking at them as a companion to perennial ryegrass, so you can actually look at how each of them performs during the season.
Yeah, so the purpose of this trial, I suppose, is to identify perhaps which of the components of those multi-species swards are individually making a difference to, say, your sward or animal performance, like on an individual basis.
So we all know they bring something to the table. It's maybe refining down where they fit into each of them. Look, the study, it's certainly topical, but it's broken down maybe into two large components. You've an animal element of that study, Lisa. You might explain what you're trying to do in that.
Yeah, so here in Athenry we run 5 groups of ewes and lambs. So we have 23 ewes in each group, and we run those on the 5 sward types that I've just mentioned. So each of the groups run on those swards from turnout after lambing, and we follow it right through until the ewes are housed around December time. And we follow the lamb's performance and the ewe performance over that time.
Essentially, each of them companion forages is a little farmlet unto itself. It's a self-contained system.
Yeah, a self-contained system, yeah.
So in animal part of the study, Lisa, you're looking at a lot of different aspects of it. You're looking at the animal performance first, I suppose. That's both the ewe and lamb performance. But you're also looking at the sward contribution to that, so in terms of production maybe, and in terms of what's becoming prevalent of that. You might explain to us a little bit more, just the kind of level of measurements you're doing in this study.
Yeah, so in terms of the animals, we're measuring the lamb live weight at all throughout its life up until slaughter, and therefore its average daily gain over that time period. And then we also measure some slaughter data from those lambs as well. And then in terms of the ewe, then we're measuring live weight and condition score at the critical times of the year to see what impact the sward might have on the ewe herself as well. Then in terms of the sward, we're measuring the sward production in terms of kilos of dry matter per hectare, so how much that sward can grow. And then also we take cuts from these swards, and they'll be sent for analysis so that you can tell the nutritive value of that sward at the various time points across the year. I suppose then the last thing that we measure is how much forage is in the sward at all the various time points of the year. And as a result of that, then we have the information to follow the contribution of the forage to the sward all across the year and across years as well, so that you can follow the persistency of those forages.
And that's something very interesting, because obviously the composition, I imagine, changes quite a lot depending on the legume or the herb that's in with the grass mix during the year. Like, I know you're only into the early stages of it, but I'm sure there's big variation there as the year progresses in terms of what the sward composition is at key time points.
Yeah, absolutely. So the forages don't give the same contribution to the sward at all time points. For example, the clovers are quite sensitive to temperature. So we've seen that there'd be quite low levels of clover, in the swards, say in the winter months, and in early spring it's quite low. But then you can follow, by taking the measurements that I've mentioned, you can follow that the clover content is increasing drastically then to a peak at around August time is usually when the clover contents have peaked in these swards. And the same then, of course, with the herbs, although they seem to be less variation across the season with those than the clovers.
And we have been part of farming, it also has to deal with the different weather conditions that crop up in various years.
Yeah.
Like, from an animal point of view, I know it's early days, there is some performance differences there. What are the kind of key highlights so far?
Yeah, so the study, I suppose that generally what we've seen, although we haven't completed the study and it's not incomplete yet, but over the course of the study so far, we have seen animal performance benefits with the inclusion of either or all of these companion forages that we're looking at are giving an animal production benefit. I suppose one figure that I had looked at was the days to slaughter over the previous 3 years, and what we've seen on average over the previous 3 years is that the days to slaughter for the groups of animals containing any of these companion forages, days to slaughter has been reduced in comparison to those grazing on a ryegrass only sward.
And like, look, it's going to be an interesting one to follow. I think the second aspect of your study really looks at one of the questions we have about some of these various companion forages, indeed mixed species. And it's similar, we were chatting to Philip previously about clover and its establishment and trying to maintain it in a sward. You're looking at that in a bit more detail in a plot study, Lisa, in the second phase of your project. You might explain to us what are the key things you're looking at in that aspect of it.
Yeah, so I suppose as a follow-on from the performance, animal and sward performance results that we've seen in the study so far, we designed a plot-based study. So these are kind of based on 3 main areas that we'd like to look at. So the first being establishment method, so how you are reseeding these forages, and the second being post-grazing sward height or grazing management, so how you're managing these swards on a grazing system, what sward heights you should be looking to achieve, and the third then is looking at the various seeding rates and also planting with a perennial ryegrass, tetraploid or a diploid perennial ryegrass. So that's the 3 main areas that we're looking at under the plot-based studies.
And that's certainly going to be of interest, because when it comes to management of these swards, like, we're relatively novice in terms of what we do. We know how to go with grass, but it's going to have challenges. Just like to ask you maybe first, the establishment methods, what were the different establishment methods you looked at?
Yeah, so we have 4 establishment methods that we're looking at under the plot study. So the first is a conventional, so that's like a full plough till sow. And the second then we were calling a disc method, where we used a disc harrow and then a power harrow and then sown. The third then being a power harrow treatment, so it just receives the power harrow and then sown. And then the fourth being the direct drill method, where it's just a one-pass system without any cultivation.
And that'll be interesting in terms of invasive species and how good an uptake you get and how long it takes to get into the sward, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So under these plot-based studies, we basically are following the forage contribution to the sward and the weed contribution to the sward, and then obviously taking the same cuttings to look at the nutritive value of these swards in the future. No, so basically what we've seen from these establishment method trials to date, I suppose, is that each one is when each one is carried out correctly, there is adequate levels of forage coming through in the sward. No one seems to be outstandingly better than any others.
No, certainly. So just like from a grazing management point of view, I know if we looked at some of the other data on it, we tend to see the mixed species swards have a higher post-grazing height possibly than what we would look for in ryegrass. What kind of heights have you looked at?
Yeah, so there are some reports that perhaps a higher post-grazing height may help these swards, and that's why we're looking at this trial. The 3 that we are imposing on the plot study at the moment are grazing to 4 centimeters, 4.75 centimeters, and 5.5 centimeters. I suppose it is a more long-term trend that you'll be looking at. You'd have to impose these heights for a longer period of time to maybe see the results, whereas the establishment method is a quicker result perhaps. So as of yet, we are not seeing any huge differences as of yet, but hopefully in the future of this study we may see some trends there.
And you might potentially see some seasonal differences in that post-grazing height as well. It'll be a very interesting one again to follow.
Absolutely, yeah. Should be very interesting in the coming year, yeah.
I suppose the final part of that is the seeding levels, and that's really being conclusive and looking at it in total. Like, I'm sure you're going to with a couple of different levels in that as well.
Yeah, so for the seeding rates, at the moment we have imposed 3 seeding rates, so a high, medium, and low amount of forage in the seeding at full seed rate. So for clovers, we were including rates of 7.5, 5, and 2.5 kilos of clover per hectare. And then for the herbs, the chicory and the plantain, we were including levels of 5, 3.5, and 2 kilos of herbs per hectare. And then so we were including this with the perennial ryegrass seed as well, and each was made up to a total seeding rate of 25 kilos per hectare.
This is coming some very good information coming out of that. Like, this is year 2 of it at the moment. How long is that study intended to run for?
Yeah, so this will be the final year of the animal grazing study, and also for the first 2 of the plot-based trials. The 3rd was seeded later, so we will continue that into 2022 as well.
It'll be a good study to keep track on. Hopefully we'll get you back on the podcast. It will be a very interesting study for people to visit if COVID restrictions lift in the future.
Absolutely, we'd be delighted.
Lisa, it was great catching up with you. Thanks very much for the information, and we look forward to hearing more about it, and good to have you on.
Thanks very much.
Okay, we're going to wrap things up at this point. Again, it was really good getting Lisa on to give us a bit more detail and background to the study she's involved in. Very interesting piece of work. I'm sure there'll be some great information coming out of it over the coming months and years, both in terms of how it affects animal performance, but also how we can actually manage those various companion forages and improve the overall performance we're getting from them. Hopefully we'll get Lisa back on at a later point in our studies to discuss it in a bit more detail with us. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for any updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.